the screen. With my Avante or the Fusion, I can use my handles. Okay, I'm going to punch a hole in my painter's tape with the full stitch. And now there's my reference for repositioning it once I advance the quilt. I've advanced my quilt, I've basted down both sides, and I've secured the sides with the clamps. I'm ready to now reposition. So I'll leave this screen, go back to the repositioning screen, and back to the drag from here. But what I want to do is, we're still using that function, I want to find that crosshair, place it right there on that top, just like we did before. Drag from here. Now, you remember that blue tape? We're going to move, not looking at the screen, but we're looking at our fabric. And we're going to move my needle up until it's right over the top of that hole that I punctured in the tape. And then I want to move the pattern to that position. Now what you look at the screen, crosshairs represent the needle. The crosshairs are at the top of my design, top left. The needle is at the top left of where I want it positioned. I'm ready to stitch again. Okay, one thing I might want to do is press my follow button, and I might want to move this along and see if things line up correctly all the way across my quilt. This is a great function because what it does is it puts the crosshairs in the center of the screen, and then it lays the pattern underneath it just as it would be on the quilt. And then I can follow this along and see if they fit nicely within each other. And this is a great feature, especially if you have a pantograph or an edge-to-edge design that does more of an S shape, and you have to see if they nudge in correctly or if there's not enough space. Okay, we're finished with this screen. We're ready to go to run quilt again. Start quilting. The machine will move it to the start point. I have all of my settings checked the way I want them. I think again I may start at a 50% speed, and then I'm ready to start quilting. I can remove my tape because I know it's positioned correctly. Pull up, move aside, resume. It's going to do my tie-offs again. Start quilting. I know that's not the speed I want to quilt at. If it's a really tight design, you may want to go at a slower speed, but this is a speed that I could move up to a higher speed and be okay. Now, if you'll look, my spacing between my designs, and we'll let this move out of the way. And as this is stitching, we can move up to look up here, and we can see that this spacing here is the same as the distance apart my two designs. So it's really going to look nice and not leave any gappy spaces between the designs. This is a great design for another variation of a stipple, so that it'll fill the quilt, but it'll quilt really fast too. It's finished quilting my second row. I'm ready now to disable my motors. Now I have the Avante, so I can use the handles. If I had the HQ16, I would be using my screen, but I need to do a full stitch, bring up my bobbin thread, and then clip my threads. Now I'm ready to move my machine to the left of the quilt, nudge the design down, the 8.75, find my positioning point, and then advance the quilt and start stitching again. I want to show you another technique in doing edge-to-edge quilting. And this technique is by loading the whole quilt, taking the measurements of the width of the quilt, the height of the quilt, and actually putting it in here and making the full repeat across and the full repeat down. So it's going to be a big file, but it really works. Okay, so what I have is a feather and flowers, and it's a border to border by Ann Bright, and it comes in at 15.42 in width, so that means that's going to be pretty big in width, and my quilt I know is 42 inches, so it's about 2.5 repeats, and I can't do a half repeat, so we're going to do a little skewing here. The height is 11.72. So for this one, I think I want to make this a little smaller design, a little denser quilting. So we're going to our quilt. I want to maybe resize this to start with. And I want my height to be about 8 inches, so it's going to be quite dense. And keep the aspect ratio. That means that that's going to resize it proportionately for the width, so I don't have to worry about that width at all. Press that. Now look at the top. My width now is 10.53 and 8 inches in height, and that's what I resized it. And look at the design, and you can see that it's still proportionate to the height and width. I'm ready to push done. I'm going to go to repeat and skew to fit. Now I'm looking at this and I'm seeing that my start point is on the bottom, and I really like my start points to be on the top. So I'll leave this screen, go back, and I want to do a mirror. Now this is my preference only. You could leave that start point on the bottom, but I like mine on the top, and later you'll see why. So I want to do a vertical mirror so that this flips it. The yellow dot now is up at the top. Okay, we're ready to move on to that skew to fit repeat. Repeat pattern and skew to fit. You'll see that I really like skew to fit. Now, I know that my quilt, the width of it was 42, and I'm actually going to make this 43 inches. So I'm making it bigger so that it will quilt off both sides of the quilt. And I know that before I place my quilt on here, I measured it, and my quilt top in length was 60 inches in the height. So I'm going to put 60 in there. Whoops, let's make sure that's 60, 0. Okay, that's my height. That's the measurement of my quilt. Now, as I look at this one pass, I know that 8 inches in height, well, let's work with our width first. 10 inches in width will go into 43 4 times and leave me some left over, but it doesn't leave it left over, it skews it. It stretches it just a little bit. You'll never notice it. So if I place 4 in here, and then in my height, I have it 60 inches. We need to lock our motors so that they don't move, and we'll type that in again, 60. We definitely want to make sure that's 60. The height of 1 is 8, and my whole height of my quilt or length of my quilt is 60. So 8 into 60 is 7. That makes 56. So we'll put 7. It'll stretch it a little bit. Now I'm ready to do the magic. But I can see on this design that my start point, or my end point I should say, is inside of the box. And if we zoom in on that, well, we won't worry about that, but that end point right there needs to connect with that start point on the next design. So I need to do a point to point. So I need to check this so that they will go point to point. It kind of does an overlap in the width across. Now I'm ready to hit the button and see the magic. Now this is a bigger file, so it's going to take a little processing. We just need to be patient. It's creating the path as it goes through. So we just need to be patient with it and not start pushing buttons. There's my quilt. The whole quilt is right there. Now you know you can't quilt that whole quilt without advancing, so we've got some advancing and some placement to do. So let's do a little bit of panning down here, and we're going to zoom in on this so we can see. You can see that dotted line. That is my jump from when it finishes quilting on the right, it will do a jump over to the left. But because that is such a large jump, that'll be 43 inches, I'm going to not let the machine do it, I will do it manually. But I want to look, and let's zoom in on this and see, how's my placement? Do I need to do some distance apart between these designs, or do they nest? And as I look at that, they look like everything nests, but let's just play with it for a minute and see, maybe I need to put a distance apart and just see what it looks like. As long as I don't leave this screen, I can keep doing this. Takes a minute for that path to be recreated. Okay, do you see the rows between there? That definitely didn't need any space between it. So we can go back and put it 0. I don't think it needed to be overlapped because I think it would have touched the previous design. So I really do think that we could just put that at 0. And I still have all my measurements, and hit this again, and it will recreate it the way it did the first time. Now this is a quilt because it's so densely quilted. I would probably not use a high loft batting. I would use a Hobbs or an 80-20 so that it quilted up nice and was still pliable. There, I really like the way that looks. Now we're ready to start quilting. No, not really. We need to position this quilt. So we're finished with this screen. Push done. Still takes a little time in processing because of the big file. So each action that we take, you're going to see this path generation. So it has to take its time and just be patient. Back. Now it's time to reposition pattern. There's my design, and let's zoom this down. Now, I have an issue. Some people worry about, I can only see one crosshair on this design. Where is the other crosshair? I'm only seeing the vertical crosshair. I need to find that horizontal crosshair. A tip. Do you see the dotted line there? And as I move this out, let's disable this. As I move that out, do you see how that's a solid line? As I move that in, how it becomes a dotted line? Well, that right there is a solid line. So that tells me that the line, the horizontal line, is above that someplace. So if I were to zoom out a lot, you would find it way up there. But it doesn't really matter because I'm going to use the find start point, and it'll put it all where it needs to be. So we're going to, before, with our previous repositioning, we used drag from here, and we looked at the screen first. Well, this time we're going to look at the fabric first. We're going to place our needle exactly where we want it. So I want to place the needle in the top left, and then I will press this find start point, and it will actually place the pattern right there. Do you see now why I put that start point at the top left corner? It makes it a lot easier for positioning. Okay, I'll press my find start point, and do you see what it did? The crosshairs are right up there, the needle is there, everything is lined up the way it should. Now it's time to start quilting. Run quilt, we'll go to that menu and start quilting. Now this one, I may want to change my stitch length. I do definitely want to slow it down as it starts, so we're going to slow it down to 50. I like that it does a tie off, it's doing my pull up, my stitching, of course. I don't need to worry about my pause delay because it's outside of the quilting area, so I can just leave that. My tie offs, there's 2 stitches. The auto jump threshold, that means that it will only go up to 6 inches automatically before I have to do a manual jump. And that jump that we talked about is that I have, when it finishes over on this side, it will stop and let me clip the threads, and rather than just drag that long thread across. So I definitely want my auto jump threshold to be under 42, because that's the width of this quilt. So right now it's at 6, that's the default, and we'll just leave it at that. I'm ready to start quilting. Start quilting. It's going to take the jump, bring up my bobbin, and I'm ready to resume. Do my tie off. And you may not want to do a tie off out here. It doesn't matter because this will be cut off, but it's just a, security. It's going to stitch slow until I see how things are going. I make sure that I have basted this really close so that it doesn't come and flip the edge over. Seems to be running okay. Do you see how it's running off of the edge? That's exactly what I want. And I would have run it off the top of the quilt as well, so that as it's cut and bound, everything looks consistent. Now the blue quilt that I showed you previously had this same pattern, and I went ahead and let it quilt the 15 inches in height, and so it was still, I thought, dense enough for the flannel that I used. The nice thing about this machine is that as I noticed there was a little problem with tension here, I can actually change on the fly. So I actually released my tension, loosened it just a little bit so that more thread went under the fabric down into the between, and let the bobbin pull that down. Now I can zoom in on this so that I can watch this as it's quilting. And I think I'm going to speed this up and see how it goes. Oh, I like that speed much better. Okay, I walked away while my machine was quilting, and when I came back, my machine had actually run out of bobbin thread. And so now my thread broke, and I need to go back to that point that it broke.